The air in the supermarket felt thick, almost suffocating, as the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glow over the checkout line. A woman stood there, clutching a small handful of grocery items, nothing extravagant, just the basics: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a couple of cans of soup. Her fingers gripped the edges of her coupons tightly, the paper crinkling slightly as she held them out, a quiet determination in her posture. She had double-checked them at home, sitting at her kitchen table under the dim light of a single bulb, making sure every detail was in order. To her, this wasn't just about saving a few dollars, it was about dignity, about proving she could manage, even when life pressed down hard. But then came the officer. He stormed into her space like a gust of wind tearing through a fragile curtain, his voice sharp and biting as he barked, "Move out of the way." His eyes glinted with a coldness that seemed to slice through the air, a blade of disdain aimed directly at her. He stood tall in his crisp uniform, the badge on his chest catching the light. A symbol of authority he wielded like a club. A smirk twisted his lips, smug and deliberate, as he glared down at her, blocking her path with an arrogance that made her stomach churn. To him, she wasn't a person with a story, a mother stretching every penny to feed her family, a woman who'd spent the morning calculating how to make it through the week. No, to him, she was just an obstacle. A target for his cruelty. Trying to use these fake coupons, he sneered, his voice rising deliberately, loud enough to ripple through the crowded aisle. Heads turned, shoppers with carts half full, a cashier frozen mid-scan, an elderly man clutching a bag of apples, all eyes swiveling toward the scene unfolding. The officer's words weren't just an accusation, they were a performance, a spotlight he shone on her to strip away her humanity. That's how you people get by, isn't it? Always cheating the system. The venom in his tone stung, each syllable dripping with contempt, and she felt it like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat, her wide eyes flickering with a storm of emotions: shock, disbelief, and a spark of fury she struggled to contain. She wasn't cheating. She'd done nothing wrong. But in that moment, the truth didn't matter, only his power did. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her groceries tighter, the weight of them grounding her as the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "Sir, I'm just trying to pay for my groceries," she said, her voice steady but soft, quivering at the edges as she fought to hold on to the last threads of her composure. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. The sting of humiliation as the crowd's whispers grew louder, their stares prickling her skin. She wanted to scream, to demand why he was doing this, but the words stuck in her throat. Trapped by the fear of making it worse. Dignity was all she had left, and she clung to it desperately, even as he loomed closer. The officer stepped forward. His shadow falling over her like a storm cloud, his smirk stretching wider as he drank in her discomfort. "Of course you are," he mocked, his voice thick with sarcasm as he leaned in. Close enough for her to smell the faint coffee on his breath. "But I'm not sure we want your kind here, you understand? So why don't you just put those down and leave before I make this official?" His words were a threat wrapped in a taunt, and he savored every second of it. His chest puffing out as if he were a king dispensing judgment in this fluorescent-lit kingdom of canned goods and checkout counters. For a heartbeat, the store fell silent. The tension so thick it pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing as she weighed her options. Should she fight back? Defend herself against this injustice, or walk away and let him win? The eyes of the onlookers bore into her, some curious, some judging, others simply relieved it wasn't them in his crosshairs. In that moment, she felt smaller than she ever had, a speck of dust caught in the wind of his authority. But beneath the fear, a flicker of resolve began to burn. She opened her mouth, ready to speak. To reclaim her voice, when a sudden commotion erupted near the store's entrance. The glass doors swung open with a sharp whoosh, and a figure strode in, his steps quick and purposeful, cutting through the idle chatter like a knife. The officer's smirk faltered, his head snapping toward the sound, confusion flashing across his face before it morphed into something darker, alarm. The man approaching was dressed in a dark suit, sharp and tailored, exuding an air of quiet command that made the air shift. His face was set, his jaw tight, and his eyes locked on the scene ahead as he closed the distance without hesitation. Before anyone could process it, he planted himself firmly between the woman and the officer. A human barrier breaking the standoff. The silence deepened, heavy and electric, as the three stood there, the woman clutching her groceries, the officer bristling with fading bravado, and this new figure radiating a calm that felt almost dangerous. Then the man spoke, his voice low and steady, but carrying a weight that seemed to pin the officer in place. "What's going on here?" It wasn't a question so much as a demand, laced with an intensity that made the officer flinch. The officer's confidence cracked, his shoulders hunching slightly as he stammered, "Nothing." His voice wavered, a feeble attempt to claw back control, but the lie hung in the air, fragile and unconvincing. The crowd sensed it too, the shift, the turning tide, and their murmurs grew. A low hum of anticipation. The man in the suit stepped closer, his gaze unwavering, piercing through the officer's crumbling facade. "Oh, it's something," he said, his tone cool but edged with steel. "I think it's time we had a little talk, don't you?" The officer's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape, but the man in the suit didn't budge. The power that had once rested so comfortably in the officer's hands was slipping away, draining like water through his fingers, and he could feel it. The woman watched, her heart pounding, as the dynamic flipped before her eyes. She was no longer the prey, no longer the one cornered. Phones emerged from pockets, screens lighting up as people began to record, their whispers swelling into a chorus of curiosity and outrage. The man in the suit didn't relent. He pressed forward, his questions sharp and unrelenting, each one peeling back another layer of the officer's bravado. "Why were you harassing her?" he asked, his voice still calm but now carrying a blade's edge. The officer tried to deflect, his words tripping over themselves, his voice cracking under the strain. I wasn't," he started, but the man cut him off, leaning in closer. "You thought nobody would notice, didn't you? You thought you could get away with it." The crowd grew bolder, their murmurs turning to gasps as the scene unfolded into something bigger, something undeniable. The officer, once so sure of his dominance, was shrinking, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. And then, in a move that stunned everyone, the man in the suit reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge. He flipped it open with a flick of his wrist, the metal catching the light, and the room seemed to inhale as one. It wasn't just any badge, it was federal, an FBI emblem that gleamed with authority. "I'm with the FBI," he said, his eyes never leaving the officer's, "and I know exactly who you are." Panic flooded the officer's face, his skin paling as the weight of those words sank in. For a split second, he stood frozen, a deer caught in the glare of oncoming headlights, and then the dam broke. The man in the suit began to speak again, his voice dropping to a near whisper but loud enough for the crowd to hear, listing off crimes, corruption, extortion, violence, secrets the officer had buried deep, believing they'd never surface. The woman's eyes widened as she listened, her earlier humiliation giving way to a quiet, burning vindication. She'd been powerless moments ago, but now she stood witness to justice unfurling, raw and unstoppable. The officer's hands shook, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he scrambled for excuses, his voice barely a whimper. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. But it was a hollow plea, drowned out by the growing roar of the crowd. The man in the suit stepped even closer, his presence towering now, not through force but through the sheer weight of truth. "Oh, I think you do," he said softly, "and I'm going to make sure everyone else does too." The supermarket transformed into a stage, the ordinary hum of daily life replaced by a reckoning. Shoppers exchanged glances, some nodding as if pieces of a puzzle were clicking into place, others gaping in disbelief as the officer's mask shattered. He wasn't just a bully flexing his power, he was a man with a history, a darkness he'd kept hidden until this moment. The woman stood taller now, her groceries still clutched to her chest. Watching as the scales tipped, as the consequences of his actions crashed down around him. This wasn't just about her anymore, or the coupons, or a single cruel encounter. It was about power abused. About the fragile line between authority and tyranny, and the moment when justice, long delayed, finally broke through. The officer's days of hiding were over. His arrogance replaced by a desperate scramble to hold on to the last scraps of control. But the man in the suit wasn't finished. What did he know? How deep did this go? The crowd leaned in. Phones still rolling, as the story began to unravel further, promising a confrontation that would reach far beyond the walls of this ordinary store. The lesson was clear: power, when wielded without accountability, is a house of cards waiting to collapse. And as the officer's world crumbled, the woman, and everyone watching, saw that justice, though slow, could be relentless. This was only the beginning, a spark igniting a fire that would burn brighter and fiercer than anyone could have imagined. In a world that had often tried to stifle his voice, Maurice had learned to wield a quiet, unshakable strength. It wasn't the kind of power that shouted or demanded attention through grand, sweeping gestures. No, his was a subtler force. One honed through years of discipline and patience, a steady resolve that carried him through life's storms. Now, as an FBI agent, he channeled that same resilience into his work. Fighting against injustice with a precision so sharp it could cut through the chaos of the world around him. His career had been built brick by brick. Each step a testament to his tireless effort and unyielding focus. Colleagues admired him for his cool-headed demeanor. The way he could walk into a room thick with tension and diffuse it without ever raising his voice. His instincts were razor-sharp, honed by experience. And when he spoke, rare as it might be, people stopped, turned, and listened. Even outside the confines of his crisp white shirt and dark suit. Maurice carried an aura of authority that clung to him like a second skin. It wasn't something he put on or took off. It was simply who he was, a man who commanded respect without ever needing to demand it. But beneath that stoic exterior lay a softer side, one reserved for the few who truly knew him. His wife, Lisa, saw it clearest of all. After long days chasing shadows and unraveling the tangled threads of crime, he'd come home to her, shedding the weight of his badge at the door. In those moments, he didn't speak of case files or interrogations, not because the work didn't matter, but because he understood the importance of leaving it behind. Instead, he'd sit with Lisa. Their conversations drifting to the small joys of life, a song they'd heard, a memory from years past, or the simple comfort of being together. For Maurice, Lisa was his anchor. The steady ground beneath his feet when the world felt like it might slip away. Lisa was everything he admired, brilliant, compassionate, and fierce in a way that lit up the room. She poured her heart into her work as a community advocate, fighting for education reform in neighborhoods too often forgotten by those in power. Where Maurice was a still lake, calm and reflective, Lisa was a rushing river, her passion spilling over into every word, every gesture. She wasn't afraid to stand tall, to raise her voice for herself or for those who couldn't. It was a strength Maurice had fallen in love with, a fire that both inspired and steadied him. Together, they were a perfect counterbalance, their partnership rooted in a deep, unspoken trust and a love that had weathered years of challenges. He adored her fearlessness, the way she faced the world head-on, but he also knew it painted a target on her back. In a society that didn't always value her strength, or even see it for what it was, Lisa's courage made her vulnerable, and that gnawed at him in quiet moments when he let his mind wander too far. They lived in Memphis, a city with a heartbeat all its own. The streets pulsed with life, jazz spilling out from the smoky clubs on Beale Street. Gospel hymns rising into the humid air on Sunday mornings. It was a place of beauty and soul, where culture wove itself into every corner. But beneath the vibrant surface simmered a darker truth. Decades of neglect, inequality, and unspoken prejudice had left scars on the city's foundation. Maurice had grown up here. His childhood shaped by the sight of those cracks, poverty that lingered like a shadow, opportunities snatched away before they could take root. Now, as an agent, he saw the fallout up close. His work wasn't just about catching criminals, it was about confronting the deeper rot, the kind of injustice that didn't always scream from headlines but sank its teeth into lives all the same. He carried that awareness with him, a quiet burden that fueled his resolve. On a sweltering afternoon, the kind where the heat clung to your skin and the air felt thick enough to chew, Lisa made her way to the supermarket. She'd spent the day at a community meeting, her voice ringing out as she fought for change, and now all she wanted was the simple solace of routine. She clutched a crumpled shopping list in her hand, ingredients for dinner, a small promise of normalcy after hours of heated debates. The store buzzed with activity, carts rattling down aisles. Voices overlapping in a familiar hum. Lisa moved through it all with a quiet grace, her mind unwinding as she picked out tomatoes and reached for a loaf of bread. There was something soothing about the ordinariness of it, a balm against the exhaustion of her day. She let herself breathe, savoring the fleeting calm. But peace, she'd learned, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the smallest disturbance. She was nearing the checkout, her basket balanced against her hip, when a voice sliced through the air, sharp, grating, and heavy with disdain. It wasn't familiar, but its tone carried an authority that demanded obedience. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see those." Lisa turned, startled, and found herself face to face with a police officer. His name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights, Officer Barnes. He stood there, blocking her path, his broad frame casting a shadow over her. There was something in his gaze that made her stomach twist, not just scrutiny, but judgment, cold and deliberate. His eyes raked over her, from the top of her head to the tips of her shoes. As if he were sizing her up, deciding her worth in a single glance. It wasn't the first time she'd felt that kind of look, but this one carried an edge, a quiet menace that set her nerves on edge. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest. Barnes smirked, a slow curl of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "You heard me. Those coupons. I've seen people like you pull this before, trying to sneak something for free. Let's see if they're real." The words hit her like a slap. Not because of their meaning but because of the venom behind them. Lisa's cheeks burned, not with shame but with a rising tide of anger. She hadn't done anything wrong, she'd checked those coupons twice, made sure they were valid. Yet here was this man, towering over her, speaking as if she were a thief caught red-handed. "They're valid," she said, her tone firm, her feet planted. She wouldn't let him see her waver. Barnes stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the bitter staleness of coffee on his breath. "Is that so?" he drawled, his voice thick with mockery. "Because I don't see why you'd need them unless you couldn't pay. Maybe you should put some of that back." The insult wasn't subtle, it was a blade, meant to cut her down, to strip away her dignity in front of the growing crowd. Lisa's heart pounded. Her mind racing as she grappled with the humiliation he was trying to force on her. This wasn't about coupons, it was about power, about him reminding her of her place, or at least the place he thought she belonged. She'd seen this game before, the way some people wielded authority like a club, but never had it felt so personal, so suffocatingly close. Around her, the store seemed to shift. Shoppers slowed their steps, their eyes darting between her and Barnes. Some averted their gazes, pretending not to see. Their discomfort palpable in the way they shuffled away. Others lingered, their curiosity tinged with something uglier, a hunger for drama, as if this were a show put on for their amusement. The store clerk, a young woman with nervous hands, hovered nearby, glancing from Lisa to Barnes and back again, her uncertainty etched into every twitch of her fingers. Lisa's hands trembled. But she clenched them into fists, refusing to let the fear show. She wanted to lash out, to tell him exactly what she thought of his petty tyranny, but she could feel the weight of every stare. The tension coiling tighter with each passing second. Miles away, Maurice sat at his desk, the faint hum of the FBI office surrounding him as he sifted through reports. The day had been long. The kind that left a dull ache in his temples, but he was focused, his pen moving steadily across the page. Then his phone buzzed, cutting through the quiet. It was a friend. Someone who'd been at the store and seen it all unfold. "You might want to get down here, man," the voice said, low and urgent. "It's Lisa. There's a cop giving her a hard time. It doesn't look good." Morris's heart lurched, a jolt of adrenaline flooding his system, but his face remained a mask of calm. "Where?" he asked, already reaching for his keys. The friend gave him the name of the store. And Maurice was out the door before the call ended. He drove faster than he should have, the city blurring past in streaks of color and sound. His mind churned, piecing together fragments of what might be happening. Lisa wasn't one to back down, she had a fire in her that he'd always loved, but she wasn't reckless either. If she was in trouble, it wasn't because she'd crossed a line, it was because someone else had. The thought twisted in his gut, a quiet fury building beneath his composed exterior. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, the leather creaking under his hands, and pressed the gas harder. Back at the supermarket, the air had grown thick with hostility. Barnes was relishing this, feeding off the power he held over her. Each time Lisa opened her mouth to speak, he cut her off, his voice louder, sharper, daring her to push back. "You think you can just waltz in here and do whatever you want?" he snapped, his tone rising to fill the space. "Not on my watch. Not today." Lisa's hands shook harder now, but she lifted her chin, her voice cutting through his bluster like a blade. "You have no right to talk to me like this. I haven't done anything wrong." Barnes's face darkened, his smirk twisting into something uglier. He leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing her. "You think you're above the law?" he sneered. "Let me remind you, I am the law." The store felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the confrontation teetered on the edge of something explosive. Lisa could feel it, the tension, the anger, the injustice of it all, like a storm about to break. But she wouldn't bend, not to him, not to anyone. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. A silent vow that she wouldn't let him win. And then, just as Barnes opened his mouth to spit another venomous word, the automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Maurice stepped inside. His stride quick and purposeful, his dark eyes sweeping the scene in an instant. He took it all in, the scattered crowd, the clerk's nervous fidgeting, and Barnes looming over Lisa with that smug, predatory grin. For a heartbeat, the two men's gazes collided, Morris's steady and unyielding, Barnes's flickering with a mix of surprise and defiance. There was a shift, subtle but undeniable, as Morris's presence rippled through the space. Barnes hesitated, just for a moment, caught off guard by the quiet intensity of the man before him. Maurice didn't speak yet, he didn't need to. He crossed the distance in a few strides, positioning himself between Lisa and Barnes, a human shield forged from love and resolve. His calm was a weapon all its own. A force that tilted the balance of power without a single raised voice. The air stilled, heavy with anticipation, as if the world itself were waiting to see what came next. Maurice stood there. His posture relaxed but immovable, a silent promise that this had gone far enough. Barnes's eyes darted, searching for a foothold, but Morris's unwavering presence unnerved him. This wasn't the reaction he'd anticipated, no fear, no retreat, just a man who refused to be shaken. "What's the problem here?" Maurice asked at last, his voice low and even, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. It wasn't a question so much as a challenge, a quiet demand for accountability. In that moment, the lesson was clear. Justice wasn't loud or ostentatious, it was deliberate, steadfast, and unrelenting. And for those like Barnes, who abused their power to belittle and oppress, the consequences would come. Not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of a reckoning long overdue. The air inside the supermarket was thick with tension. A simmering storm barely contained beneath the fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Maurice stood rooted to the spot, his posture steady, his breathing measured. But there was something razor-sharp lurking beneath his calm exterior, a quiet fury wrapped in restraint, like a storm cloud holding back its lightning. His dark eyes, usually warm and thoughtful, now glinted with an intensity that made the space around him feel smaller, more charged. Beside him, Lisa clutched the grocery basket tightly, her knuckles widening against the handle. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her lips parted as if words were clawing their way out, only to be swallowed back down. She was a coiled spring of frustration and indignation. Her silence louder than any shout. Across from them stood Barnes, the store's self-appointed gatekeeper, his uniform wrinkled and his badge gleaming dully under the artificial glow. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his movements jittery, betraying the smug grin he tried to plaster across his face. That grin, once sharp and cutting, now wavered like a flickering flame about to gutter out. "No problem," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he tossed out a careless shrug. "Just handling a situation. Keeping everything in line." His words were casual, but there was a brittleness to them, a crack in the facade he'd built. His gaze darted toward Lisa, and for a fleeting moment, his lip curled in disdain, his eyes narrowing as if she were something distasteful he'd scraped off his shoe. "Your wife here was trying to pull a fast one with some shady coupons. I'm just doing my job." Lisa's breath hitched, her anger flaring hot and immediate. She opened her mouth, ready to fire back, her words already forming like sparks on her tongue, sharp, justified, furious. But before she could unleash them, Morris's hand rose gently, a subtle gesture that stopped her mid-breath. His touch was light, but it carried the weight of authority. A silent plea for patience. She met his eyes, and in them, she saw not just calm but calculation, a man who knew the battlefield and understood the cost of every move. Her frustration didn't fade. It churned inside her, a restless tide battering against the dam of her restraint. She trusted Maurice, but oh, how she wanted to tear into this petty tyrant standing before them. Maurice tilted his head slightly, his voice smooth but edged with a quiet challenge. "Questionable," he echoed, letting the word hang in the air like a dare. He took a step closer. His presence steady and unyielding, the kind of calm that unnerves the unsteady. "From where I'm standing, she was just trying to buy groceries, milk, bread, maybe some cereal for the kids. Unless you're telling me there's a law against that now, Officer Barnes?" His tone was polite, almost conversational, but there was a steel thread running through it. A warning woven into the fabric of his words. Barnes bristled, his chest puffing out as he stepped forward, trying to claw back the authority he felt slipping through his fingers. His smile twisted into something uglier, a sneer that bared his teeth like a cornered animal. "I don't know who you think you are," he snapped, his voice rising, "but I'm the one in charge here. If I say there's a problem, then there's a damn problem. Maybe you should tell your wife to watch herself next time." His words were a shove, a desperate grab at dominance, but they landed hollow, echoing in the growing stillness of the store. Morris's eyes darkened, a shadow passing over them, but his face remained a mask of control. Inside, though, a fire burned, a deep, righteous anger stoked by years of watching men like Barnes wield power like a club, heedless of who they bruised. "And maybe you should learn to do your job without harassing innocent people," he replied, his voice low and cutting, each syllable precise as a blade. "Especially when you're so clearly stepping over the line." The air between them crackled, heavy with unspoken stakes. Around them, the crowd thickened, shoppers pausing mid-aisle, their carts abandoned, their whispers rising like a chorus. Phones emerged from pockets, lenses glinting as they captured the scene. A dozen tiny spotlights illuminating the unfolding drama. This wasn't just about coupons or a grocery run gone wrong. Maurice knew that in his bones. This was about power, who claimed it, who abused it, and who had the courage to strip it away. Barnes felt it too, though he'd never admit it. His face flushed a deep, angry red, and for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides, the veins in his hands bulging as if he might lash out. "You better watch yourself," he growled, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. "You don't want to get tangled up in this. I can make your life hell." Maurice didn't flinch. He stood taller, his calm unshaken, a pillar amidst the storm. "You're already making things difficult," he said, his tone even but laced with an unyielding resolve. "And I'd suggest you think long and hard about your next step, officer. Because I'm not going anywhere." His words were a gauntlet thrown down. A quiet promise that he wouldn't be cowed. For a heartbeat, Barnes looked ready to explode. His eyes were wild, his breathing ragged, his body coiled as if he might lunge. But then something flickered across his face, hesitation, maybe even a flicker of fear. He took a step back, his gaze darting around the store, suddenly aware of the sea of eyes fixed on him. The phones recording his every twitch. "You don't scare me," he muttered, but the bravado rang hollow, his voice trembling at the edges. "I'm not trying to scare you," Maurice replied, his eyes locking onto Barnes with a piercing clarity. "I'm trying to warn you." His words carried a weight that settled over the room, a quiet prophecy of consequences yet to come. Lisa watched it all unfold, her heart hammering against her ribs. Relief washed over her in waves, mingling with a simmering anger that refused to cool. She could see the cracks forming in Barnes's armor, the way his shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the way his sneer faltered. But she wasn't naive, this wasn't over. Maurice had stepped in like a shield, but Barnes still clung to the tattered scraps of his authority, his eyes flicking toward the crowd as if searching for an angle. A way to twist this back in his favor. "You people think you can just," he began, his voice rising again, grasping for control. "Don't," Maurice cut in, his voice booming now, sharp and final. A clap of thunder that silenced the store. The single word reverberated off the shelves, a warning bell tolling through the aisles. "You've already said enough." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were riveted on the two men, Barnes, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, and Maurice, unyielding, a force of quiet strength. For the first time, Barnes seemed adrift, his confidence unraveling thread by thread. Maurice seized the moment, his voice steady as he pulled out his phone. "If there's a real issue here, we can handle it the right way," he said, his fingers moving deliberately over the screen. "I can call your precinct, get a supervisor down here, and we can sort this out properly. Or you can apologize to my wife, and we can all walk away." The threat hung heavy in the air, a crossroads laid bare. Barnes stiffened, his eyes narrowing to slits, his lips trembling with suppressed rage. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, fragile as glass. "I'm not scared of you or your badge. Maurice raised an eyebrow, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, I think you should be," he said, his tone almost gentle. But there was a promise beneath it, a hint of something larger, something inevitable. "Because this is just the beginning." Time seemed to freeze. Barnes stood there. A statue of defiance and desperation, his chest heaving. Then, in a flash of reckless fury, he did the unthinkable. He lunged forward and slapped the phone from Morris's hand. The device skittered across the tiled floor with a harsh clatter, the sound slicing through the stillness like a gunshot. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. A sharp intake of breath as if the store itself had recoiled in shock. Lisa's pulse surged, adrenaline flooding her veins, a molten mix of disbelief and rage. She stepped forward, her fists clenched, ready to unleash every ounce of her pent-up fury. But Morris's hand caught her arm, firm yet gentle, holding her back. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady as granite, though his eyes blazed with a fire she hadn't seen before. "He's already made his choice." Barnes glared at them, his face a mask of flushed, trembling anger. "You think you're better than me?" He spat, his words venomous, dripping with contempt. "Just because you've got a fancy suit and a cushy job? You're nothing, you and your wife, you're just—" "Enough," Maurice said. His voice like tempered steel, cutting through the tirade. For the first time, Barnes faltered, his words dying in his throat. "This isn't about who's better," Maurice continued, stepping closer, his presence towering. "This is about what's right. And you're on the wrong side of that line." Barnes's eyes darted wildly, scanning the faces around him, shoppers, cashiers, strangers, all watching, all recording. The weight of their scrutiny crashed over him, and for a moment, he looked lost, a man adrift in a tide he couldn't control. How had it come to this? How had he, with his badge and his bluster, been reduced to this trembling figure under the harsh glare of a dozen phone screens? Maurice pressed forward, his voice low but resonant. "You can't bully your way out of this, not this time." The words were a quiet decree, a line drawn in the sand. Barnes took another step back, his expression a tangled mess of fear and defiance. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper, edged with desperation. "I can make your life hell. You think you can just walk away?" Morris's gaze was cold, unflinching. "No," he said, his words heavy with intent. "But I can make sure you don't walk away either." The air thickened with the promise of reckoning, and Barnes's face twisted, a flash of panic breaking through his crumbling bravado. Before he could muster a response, a new sound pierced the tension, the wail of sirens, sharp and insistent, growing louder with every second. Heads turned toward the entrance, the crowd shifting as blue and red lights began to dance across the glass doors, painting the store in an ominous glow. Barnes's facade shattered completely. His shoulders slumping, his eyes wide and frantic as he searched for an escape that wasn't there. Maurice stood motionless, his expression unchanging, as if he'd known this was coming all along. Lisa's heart pounded, her anger now tempered by a strange, unsteady hope. The sirens grew deafening, the lights blinding. And it was clear to everyone that this petty confrontation had spiraled into something far greater, a collision of justice and consequence. A reckoning for a man who'd abused his power one time too many. The store buzzed with murmurs, the crowd swelling as uniformed officers pushed through the doors, their boots thudding against the floor. Barnes's hands twitched at his sides, his bravado gone, replaced by a raw, animal panic. Maurice remained still, a calm eye in the storm, his gaze never leaving the unraveling officer. This wasn't just about a moment in a supermarket, it was about the deeper truth of accountability. About the inevitable fallout when arrogance overreaches. As the officers approached, their voices sharp and commanding, the real question lingered in the air: when the dust settled? When the secrets and lies were laid bare, who would be left standing? Maurice, steady and resolute, seemed to know the answer. He'd fought not just for Lisa, not just for himself, but for something bigger, a lesson carved in the chaos. Power unchecked is a house of cards, and justice, patient and relentless, always finds a way to topple it. The stage was set. The players locked in their roles, and as the lights flashed and the sirens wailed, the story was only beginning to unfold. The murmur of the crowd filled the small, dimly lit store, their restless energy buzzing like static in the air. Maurice stood motionless, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes flicking briefly to the phone still recording in someone's trembling hand before settling back on the man in front of him, Officer Barnes. The man's uniform was crisp, the badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, but there was a crack in his composure now, a fracture Maurice could feel widening with every passing second. "You called them," Barnes said, his voice quivering despite the bravado he tried to cling to, a shaky attempt at menace that sounded more like a plea. His hands twitched at his sides, betraying the storm brewing beneath his skin. "You called the cops on me?" Maurice didn't flinch. His face remained an unshakable mask of calm, though inside, a quiet fire burned, a steady, controlled blaze fueled by months of watching, waiting, and piecing together the truth. "No," he replied, his voice smooth and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "I called them for you." Barnes blinked, his mouth opening and then snapping shut, as if the words were a puzzle he couldn't quite fit together. Confusion twisted his features, but beneath it, something darker flickered, desperation. Maybe even the first sharp pang of fear. "What the hell are you talking about?" he barked, his tone jagged now, teetering on the edge of panic. His eyes darted around, searching for an anchor in the sea of faces staring back at him, but all he found was judgment. Maurice took a single, measured step forward, his boots scuffing faintly against the worn linoleum floor. The air seemed to thicken around him, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. "You said you were just doing your job," he began, his voice steady, almost casual, like they were two old friends catching up over coffee. But there was an edge beneath it, a cold current running through every syllable. "But your job doesn't include tormenting innocent people. It doesn't give you permission to loom over someone, to make them feel small, to strip them of their dignity just because you've got that badge pinned to your chest." Barnes's gaze flicked sideways, landing on Lisa, who stood just behind Maurice. She was a slim figure in a faded jacket, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, but her stance had shifted. Once, she'd shrunk under Barnes's shadow, her shoulders hunched, her voice swallowed by fear. Now, though, her chin was lifted, her hazel eyes blazing with a defiance that hadn't been there before. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The fury radiating from her was a silent roar, a testament to the strength she'd reclaimed standing beside Maurice. For so long, she'd felt like a ghost in her own life, invisible and powerless. But today, with the man she trusted most at her side, she was done letting the world walk over her. "You've been hiding behind that badge for too long," Maurice went on, his voice dropping lower, colder, each word landing like a stone in still water. "You think it makes you invincible, untouchable. You think it's a free pass to do whatever you damn well please." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting Barnes feel the weight of his stare. "But you're wrong." Barnes bristled, his chest puffing out as he tried to claw back some semblance of control. "You don't know anything about me," he snapped, his voice cracking like dry timber. "You don't know what I've been through, what I have to deal with every single day." His hands balled into fists, his knuckles whitening, but the tremor in them was impossible to hide. Morris's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile, a fleeting shadow of amusement that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I know more than you think," he said, his voice dipping to a near whisper. yet it carried through the room with chilling clarity. "I know exactly who you are, Officer Barnes. And so do they." He tilted his head slightly, gesturing toward the crowd without breaking eye contact. At that moment, the chime of the store's glass door rang out, sharp and sudden, cutting through the hum of voices. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. The taller of the two, a man with a stern jaw and eyes like steel, scanned the scene with practiced precision. His gaze lingered on Barnes for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and Maurice caught it, the faint flicker of recognition. A silent acknowledgement of something unspoken between them. "We got a call about an incident," the tall officer said, his voice steady but firm, like a man who'd seen too much to be rattled easily. He adjusted his stance, his hand resting casually near his belt. "Officer Barnes, what's going on here?" Barnes straightened up, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's nothing." "Really," he said, his tone too light, too rehearsed. "Just a misunderstanding. I was handling it." His hands shook slightly as he smoothed his uniform, a futile attempt to pull himself together. The officer's eyes narrowed, shifting to Maurice, who stepped forward with the calm assurance of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. He reached into his jacket pocket, producing a small, crisp card and handing it over with a steady hand. "I'm Agent Maurice Hill, FBI," he said, his voice ringing clear and unshakable, carrying the authority of a man who knew the power of his words. "And I need to have a word with your colleague here." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, the sound swelling and then dissolving into a stunned silence that pressed against the walls of the cramped store. Barnes's face drained of color, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray as he stumbled back a step, his wide eyes darting between the card and Maurice. "Your FBI?" he stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if saying them aloud might make them less real. "Yes," Maurice replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt, no crack for Barnes to slip through. "And I've been looking into you for a while now." "Barnes." He let the name hang in the air, sharp and deliberate, a quiet accusation in itself. Barnes shook his head, his mouth twisting into a sneer that didn't quite mask the panic clawing at him. "This is," he muttered, his voice faltering. "You can't just." "I can," Maurice cut in, his words slicing through the air like a guillotine. "And I did. You thought you could keep it all buried, didn't you? That no one would care enough to dig up the dirt you've been leaving behind. But I've seen it all, the bribes you pocketed, the false charges you slapped on people too poor or too scared to fight back, the threats you hissed in dark corners, the violence you let spill out when you thought no one was watching." The 2 officers exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. The shorter one, a wiry man with a weathered face, shifted his weight, his brow furrowing as he processed what he was hearing. The tall one turned back to Barnes, his voice dropping low, taut with tension. "Is this true?" Barnes opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a cornered animal, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with the realization that the walls he'd built around himself were crumbling. For a fleeting second, Maurice felt a twinge of something close to pity, a faint echo of sympathy for a man who'd dug his own grave one choice at a time. But it vanished as quickly as it came. Maurice pivoted to face the crowd, his voice rising to fill every corner of the room. "How many of you have felt the sting of this man's so-called justice?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces, some familiar, etched with quiet pain he'd come to recognize over months of investigation, others strangers whose stories he could only guess at. "How many of you have been humiliated, threatened, forced to bow to his will just because he had a badge and thought it made him a god?" A low murmur stirred among the onlookers, a rumble of shared anger and buried hurt. Then, slowly, tentatively, a hand rose, a woman near the back, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Another followed. A young man with a faded hoodie, his jaw clenched tight. Then another, and another, until a forest of hands lifted into the air, trembling but resolute. Maurice watched as the ripple spread. As the crowd woke to a truth they'd been too afraid to name until now. This wasn't just about one man's crimes, it was about a system that had let him thrive. About the fragile hope that justice might finally tip the scales. This isn't just about what happened here today, Maurice said, his voice steady and strong, a beacon in the storm. This is about accountability. It's about making damn sure that people like Barnes can't keep wielding power like a weapon without facing the consequences they deserve. Barnes was shaking now. His face a twisted mask of rage and terror. "You think you can ruin my life," he spat, his voice breaking, raw with desperation. "You think you can just waltz in here and... You ruined your own life." Maurice shot back, his tone icy and unyielding. "Every time you chose to twist your authority into a tool for pain instead of protection. Every time you stepped on someone because you could, that was your choice. Not mine." The tall officer stepped forward, his shadow falling over Barnes, who flinched as if expecting the cold bite of handcuffs. "Wait," Barnes pleaded, throwing his hands up, his voice high and frantic. "You don't understand, it's not what it looks like. You think this is a game?" Morris's voice boomed, sharp and commanding, silencing the room. "You think you can talk your way out of this? We have evidence, Barnes, records, testimonies. Video footage. It's all there, and it's all coming out. Every dirty secret you thought you'd buried." For a moment, Barnes stood frozen, his mouth working soundlessly, grasping for a lifeline that wasn't there. Then, slowly, a hollow, bitter laugh spilled from his lips, jagged and unhinged. "You think anyone's going to care?" he said, his eyes wild, gleaming with a manic edge. "I'm a cop. They'll back me up. They always do." Maurice took a step closer, his expression hardening into something unyielding, a wall of resolve Barnes couldn't breach. "Not this time," he said, his voice low and resolute. "Because I've made sure they can't. I've already spoken to your precinct. I've talked to the DA. They know exactly what kind of man you are. And they're done looking the other way." The smirk slid off Barnes's face, replaced by a dawning horror that carved deep lines into his features. "No," he whispered, shaking his head as if he could will the truth away. "No, you can't." "Yes, I can," Maurice said, his voice a quiet thunder. "And I will." The officers moved in then, their steps deliberate, their faces grim. Barnes didn't fight this time. He let them take his arms, his hands limp, his eyes hollow as the reality crashed over him like a tidal wave. There was no escape. No slick excuse to slither through the cracks. The crowd watched in silence as he was led toward the door, the weight of the moment settling over them like dust after a storm. As Barnes disappeared through the entrance, Maurice turned to Lisa. She stood rooted to the spot, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white, her breath shallow but steady. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softening, the hard edges melting away into something tender and warm. She nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears, not of sorrow, but of a fierce, hard-won relief. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice fragile but firm, a thread of steel woven through it. "Thank you." Maurice reached out, his hand finding hers, his fingers closing gently around her trembling ones. For a moment, they stood there, the chaos of the world fading into a distant hum. It had been a long, brutal journey, months of shadows and secrets, of fighting against a tide that seemed relentless. But they'd made it through, together. And as he looked into her eyes, Maurice knew this wasn't just about Barnes. It was about every soul who'd been crushed under the weight of unchecked power. And every soul who'd rise again because people like him and Lisa refused to let the darkness win. As they turned to leave, the tall officer approached, his boots scuffing the floor. "Agent Hill," he said, his tone laced with a quiet respect. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone stand up to Barnes like that." We'd heard whispers, rumors about what he was doing, but he trailed off, his jaw tightening as he searched for the right words. "Thank you for doing what we couldn't." Maurice met his gaze, his expression somber. "This isn't over," he said, glancing back at the doorway where Barnes had been hauled away. "There are others out there, others who think they're above the law. We have to make sure this doesn't stop here." The officer nodded, a flicker of determination sparking in his eyes. "If you need anything, let us know. We'll be there." Maurice gave a curt nod, then turned back to Lisa. Together, they stepped out into the cool night air, the weight of the day clinging to them like damp clothes. The street outside was quiet, the neon glow of the store's sign casting long shadows across the pavement. But in that silence, there was a promise, a vow that justice, though slow and hard-fought, could still prevail. And as they walked away, hand in hand, Maurice felt the ember of that promise burn brighter, a light to guide them through whatever battles lay ahead. The air felt lighter that evening, as if a suffocating storm had finally rolled away, leaving behind a fragile stillness. Maurice Hill walked beside Lisa through the sprawling parking lot of the Memphis supermarket, their hands clasped tightly together. The victory they just claimed was small but undeniable, a single battle won in what Maurice knew would be a long, grueling war. The tension that had gripped his chest for hours began to loosen, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Justice, even in its tiniest flicker, felt possible for the first time in a while. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Maurice let himself entertain a fleeting thought: maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. But beneath that hope lingered a gnawing question: how far did Officer Barnes' influence stretch, and how many others like him were out there, cloaked in authority, waiting for their own reckoning? It was a puzzle Maurice vowed to solve, no matter the cost. As they stepped out of the supermarket's sliding doors, the scene that greeted them was chaotic yet strangely alive. A crowd had gathered, drawn like moths to the flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars parked haphazardly across the lot. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, some curious, some anxious, and others carrying a faint but unmistakable trace of hope. For too long, men like Barnes had wielded power with no fear of consequence, their badges a shield against accountability. But today, something had shifted. Maurice could feel it in the air, a subtle crack in the armor of impunity. Beside him, Lisa's grip tightened, her fingers digging into his palm. He stole a glance at her, catching the steel in her jawline, the way her lips pressed into a determined line. She'd been through a nightmare inside that store, humiliated, cornered, and bullied by a man who thought his uniform made him untouchable. Yet here she was, unbroken, her spirit blazing brighter than ever. "You did it," she murmured, her voice soft but thick with emotion, pride, relief, and something deeper, like the first breath after being underwater too long. "You really did it." Maurice shook his head, his gaze dropping to the cracked asphalt beneath their feet. "Not yet," he said, his tone low, almost lost in the hum of the crowd. It was as much a promise to himself as it was to her. "This is just the start." They were nearing their car when a figure emerged from the throng, his stride purposeful, his expression grim. Maurice recognized him instantly, Detective Harris. A man he'd crossed paths with on a handful of local cases. Harris was a rarity in the force, blunt, unyielding, and known for staring down corruption even when it meant standing alone. His dark eyes locked onto Morris's as he approached, giving a curt nod. "Agent Hill," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of urgency. "Heard what went down in there?" got a minute? Maurice nodded, turning to Lisa with a gentle gesture toward the car. She hesitated, her eyes searching his for a moment, then offered a small, understanding nod before stepping away. Harris led him off to the side, away from the murmur of the crowd, the glow of the patrol lights casting long shadows across his weathered face. "I'll cut to it," Harris began. His voice hushed but intense, like a man who'd held onto a secret too long. "Barnes isn't a lone wolf. We've had complaints about him before, plenty of them, but they never stick. Every time we try to dig, it's like slamming into concrete. And it's not just him. There are others, higher up, pulling strings to keep him safe." Maurice listened, his jaw tightening as the words sank in. He'd suspected as much. Barnes' swagger, his casual cruelty, it all reeked of a man who knew he'd never face the music. That kind of confidence didn't grow in a vacuum, it was fed by a system rotten with complicity. "So you're saying this runs deeper than one dirty cop," Maurice replied, his voice flat but edged with a simmering anger. Harris nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Deeper than you'd believe. If you want to take him down, really take him down, that footage from today won't be enough. You've got to go for the root, not just the branches." The weight of Harris's words pressed against Morris's chest, heavy and unyielding. He stood there for a moment, silent, letting the implications swirl in his mind. This wasn't just about what had happened to Lisa anymore, it was about tearing apart a machine that churned out men like Barnes, protecting them while they preyed on the powerless. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Harris took a slow breath, as if steeling himself. "We need someone who can get the proof we can't. Internal affairs is a dead end, every investigation gets buried before it even starts. But you're FBI. You've got reach, files, records. Things they've swept under the rug. If we can shine a light on what Barnes and his cronies have been doing, we might bring the whole damn thing crashing down." Maurice let the idea settle, feeling its enormity like a physical thing. This was a line in the sand, a choice between walking away and diving headfirst into a fight that could swallow him whole. He met Harris's gaze, seeing the flicker of resolve there, tinged with a shadow of fear. "I'm in," Maurice said, his voice firm, unshakable. "But I need to know you're with me. I can't do this solo." Harris didn't flinch. "I'm in," he replied, his tone solid as stone. "But we've got to play this smart. Barnes won't go quietly, and he's got allies just as filthy as he is." As they spoke, Maurice felt his phone buzz in his pocket, a sharp jolt against the tension of the moment. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen, a text from an unknown number. The words stared back at him, cold and menacing. "I know what you're doing. Stop now, or you'll regret it." His eyes narrowed, a coil of anger tightening in his gut. He'd expected resistance, but not this fast, not this blatant. "What is it?" Harris asked, catching the shift in Morris's demeanor. Maurice tilted the phone toward him, letting Harris read the message. The detective's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "They're already trying to rattle you," he said. "That means you're onto something." Maurice slipped the phone back into his pocket, his mind racing. "Let them try," he said quietly, but there was a spark in his eyes now, a fire igniting where exhaustion had been. "They don't know who they're messing with." The next morning, Maurice sat hunched over his desk, the dim glow of his computer screen casting harsh shadows across his face. He'd been up all night, fueled by coffee and a relentless drive to uncover the truth. Files and case reports sprawled across the monitor, pages of numbers, names, and dates that told a story of corruption so subtle it was almost invisible. But Maurice had a knack for spotting what others overlooked, and bit by bit, the pieces were falling into place. There were payments, small but regular. funneled into a shadowy consulting firm with no real footprint. Cases closed too fast, suspects walking free without explanation, complaints against officers vanishing into thin air. It was a web. Intricate and deliberate, and Maurice was starting to see its shape. But even as he worked, a prickling unease gnawed at him. The text from last night wasn't just a threat, it was a dare. A signal that he was being watched. Whoever sent it wasn't going to slink away quietly. He was close to something big, and that made him a target. The thought didn't scare him, it sharpened his focus. Turned his determination into something fierce and unyielding. He was about to dive deeper when his office phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the silence. He picked it up. Expecting a routine call, but the voice on the other end sent a chill down his spine. "You're playing a dangerous game, Agent Hill," it said, calm but laced with menace. "Barnes was just doing his job. Keep pushing, and you'll force our hand." Morris's grip on the receiver tightened, his knuckles whitening. "Who is this?" he demanded. But the voice only chuckled, a low, mocking sound that set his teeth on edge. "Someone with a lot more to lose than you," it replied. "Walk away, and this ends quietly. Keep digging. And we'll make sure you regret it." His jaw clenched, but he forced his voice to stay even. "I don't scare easy," he said, low and deliberate. "And I'm not walking away." "Then you're a fool." The voice shot back, and the line went dead. Maurice set the phone down, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't just intimidation, it was desperation, a crack in their facade. They were scared, and that meant he was closing in. He didn't have time to linger on it, though, because the door creaked open, and Lisa stepped inside. Her face was pale. Her eyes wide with a fear she was trying hard to hide. "Maurice," she said, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "There's something you need to see." She handed him her phone. And his stomach dropped as he saw the screen. It was a video, grainy but clear enough, a shot of their house from across the street, taken that morning as they'd climbed into their car. The camera zoomed in, lingering on their faces, then pulled back, the message unmistakable: "We're watching you." "They're trying to scare us," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. But there was a spark of defiance in her eyes, a refusal to let them win. "But we..." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Maurice felt it too, the lesson sinking deep into his bones. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a fight, a reckoning for those who'd abused their power and thought they'd never pay. The consequences of that arrogance were coming. And Maurice would make sure of it, no matter how many shadows tried to stand in his way. The air in the room felt suffocating as Maurice stared at the flickering screen. The grainy video looping endlessly before his eyes. Each frame fueled a fire deep within him, a rage so fierce it clawed at his chest, threatening to burst free. He turned to Lisa. Her face illuminated by the dim glow of the monitor, and saw the same storm brewing in her eyes. "They think they can scare us into submission," he said. His voice quivering not with fear but with a fury so raw it shook his very core. "They think they can force us to back off, but all they've done is light a match under us. We're not stopping, Lisa. Not now. Not ever." His words hung heavy, a vow etched into the silence that followed. Lisa's hand reached for his, her fingers wrapping around his with a strength that anchored him. Her grip was unyielding, a silent promise that mirrored the fire in her gaze. "Then we face this together," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "No matter what it takes, Maurice. We'll see this through." Her eyes burned with a fierce resolve, and in that moment, he felt the weight of their shared burden lighten just enough to keep going. Later that evening, as the city of Memphis settled into an uneasy stillness, Maurice sat across from Harris in a cramped, dimly lit diner. The faint hum of a flickering neon sign outside buzzed in the background, casting jagged shadows across the worn tabletop. Between them lay a plan, scribbled notes, timelines, and names, a blueprint born of desperation and determination. It was a gamble, one that could either topple the towering web of corruption they'd uncovered or bury them beneath its collapse. Harris had rallied a handful of officers, men and women whose weariness of the system had turned to quiet rebellion. These weren't just bodies filling seats. They were souls sickened by years of watching justice twist and bend under the weight of power. Together, they'd decided, gather Morris's evidence, corner Barnes, and pry the truth from his lips. Name by damning name. Yet as they hashed out the details, a gnawing unease coiled in Morris's gut. The deeper they dug, the darker the shadows grew. Barnes wasn't some lone wolf. He was a cog in a machine far bigger than any of them had imagined, backed by forces that thrived on silence and blood. This could get ugly, Maurice muttered, his fingers tracing the edge of a coffee-stained map. Barnes won't roll over without a fight, and whoever's pulling his strings, they've already shown they don't play clean. Harris nodded, his jaw tight, but there was a glint in his eye, a spark of defiance that matched Morris's own. Neither of them spoke it aloud, but they both knew, this wasn't just a battle for evidence. It was a reckoning. The clock was creeping toward midnight when Morris's phone buzzed, the sharp sound slicing through the quiet like a blade. He fished it from his pocket, his heart sinking as he read the message glowing on the screen. You should have listened. Simple. Cold. A threat wrapped in 5 words that sent a shiver racing down his spine. He slid the phone toward Harris, who scanned it with a furrowed brow before letting out a low, gravelly chuckle. They're rattled, Harris said, leaning back in his chair. People don't send messages like that unless they're scared. And scared people slip up. Let's make sure this is a mistake they'll live to regret. Maurice met his gaze, his own eyes hardening like steel. Let's end this, he said, the words a quiet vow as they rose and stepped into the night. The drive through Memphis was a study in contrasts, the city streets cloaked in a deceptive calm, the air thick with tension that pressed against the car's windows. Maurice gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles widening as the weight of their mission bore down on him. Every shadowed alley they passed, every flicker of movement in the dark, whispered of danger. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were mice scampering toward a trap, jaws poised to snap shut. But there was no turning back, not after all he'd seen. Not after the years he'd spent watching men like Barnes wield power like a cudgel, crushing anyone who dared stand in their way. Justice wasn't just a word to him now, it was a fire in his bones. A debt he intended to collect. They pulled up to the precinct under a sky bruised with clouds, the building looming like a fortress in the gloom. Harris had arranged a late-night meeting in a secure office, a space tucked away from prying eyes. Maurice had spent hours preparing, sorting through stacks of documents, piecing together messages, and cataloging footage that painted a portrait of Barnes's corruption so vivid it could choke the breath from anyone who saw it. Bribes slipped into eager hands, arrests staged to silence dissent. Evidence vanishing like smoke, all of it meticulously documented, a noose tightening around Barnes's neck. But Maurice knew the real fight wasn't just in the confrontation. It was in ensuring the truth clawed its way into the open, past the walls of a system designed to bury it. Harris led the way through the precinct's maze of corridors, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting stark shadows on the peeling paint. They reached a small room where 2 younger officers waited, Jenkins and Carter. Their faces taut with nerves but their postures rigid with purpose. Jenkins, barely 30, shifted his weight from foot to foot, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm against his thigh. Carter, a wiry woman with sharp eyes, stood by the window, peering out into the dark as if expecting trouble to come crashing through the glass. Maurice could feel their unease, a mirror to his own. But beneath it lay something stronger, a hunger for change, a refusal to let the rot fester any longer. "Everyone ready?" Harris asked, his voice a low rumble that cut through the tension. The officers nodded, and Maurice caught the flicker of steel in their eyes. They weren't here out of obligation, they were here because they believed, because they, too, had seen the cost of letting men like Barnes run unchecked. "Barnes will be here soon," Harris continued, glancing at his watch. "He thinks this is just a routine chat. But once he's in this room, we make it clear what's at stake. We need him to talk, willingly or not. If he digs in, we bury him with what we've got." Maurice exhaled, steadying himself. "He'll talk," he said, his voice firm. "We'll make him see he's got no moves left. This isn't just about him, it's about everyone he's shielded. We're tearing it all down." The room fell silent, the gravity of their words settling like dust after a storm. Then the door creaked open, and Barnes stepped in, his broad frame filling the threshold. He carried himself with the same swagger Maurice had come to despise, a cocky tilt to his chin, a smirk tugging at his lips. But as his eyes swept the room, landing on Maurice, Harris, and the two officers, something shifted. A flicker of doubt darted across his face, quickly masked by a forced casualness. "What's this about?" he asked. His tone light but edged with a tremor he couldn't quite hide. "Why the late-night party?" Maurice didn't flinch. "Sit down, Barnes," he said, his voice flat, cutting through the pretense like a knife. "We've got things to discuss." Barnes hesitated, his gaze narrowing as he sized them up. But Maurice could see the cracks forming, the uncertainty seeping into his bravado. "I've got nothing to say," Barnes shot back, crossing his arms, but his defiance felt brittle. A shield already starting to buckle. "Then listen," Maurice said, sliding a thick folder across the table with a slow, deliberate push. "That's every dirty move you've made over the last few years, bribes you've pocketed, arrests you've faked, evidence you've buried. It's all there, Barnes. Witnesses. Bank records. Video. And it's not just you, it's the whole network you've been running with." The color drained from Barnes's face, his swagger crumbling as he stared at the folder like it was a live grenade. For a heartbeat, Maurice thought he might lunge for the door, but Barnes sank into the chair, his hands gripping the arms as if to steady himself. "This is crazy," Barnes stammered, his voice trembling now, stripped of its earlier bluster. "You can't throw accusations like this around without proof." Harris leaned forward, his eyes boring into Barnes like a predator sizing up prey. "We've got proof," he said, his tone icy. "Enough to splash your face across every news outlet in Memphis. Keep pretending you're clean, and we'll let the world decide. Or you can start talking, who's in this with you? Cooperate, and maybe there's a way out. Stonewall us, and you're finished." Barnes's silence stretched taut, his mind visibly churning as he wrestled with the noose tightening around him. Maurice watched the war play out in his eyes, pride clashing with survival, arrogance buckling under fear. For years, Barnes had thrived on impunity, a king in a kingdom built on intimidation. Now, that kingdom was crumbling, and the terror of his own vulnerability was sinking in. "You don't get it," Barnes finally rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I talk, I'm dead. They'll make sure I vanish, and none of this will ever see daylight. This isn't just me, it's bigger than you can imagine." Maurice leaned back, studying him, searching for the breaking point. "You're done either way, Barnes," he said quietly, his words measured but unyielding. "We're exposing this, with or without you. Your only play is how you go down, alone, taking the fall for them, or giving us what we need to burn it all to the ground. Justice isn't optional here. You've abused power long enough, and the consequences are catching up. Choose." Barnes swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as fear etched deeper lines into his face. He'd spent his life doling out threats, now, he was the one cornered, and the irony wasn't lost on Maurice. Harris broke the silence, his voice softer but no less firm. "They're not here, Barnes. We are. And if you don't help us, you're looking at charges that'll lock you away for life. Think about your wife, your kids. This is your last shot to salvage something." Barnes's hands shook as he reached for the folder, flipping it open with fingers that fumbled over the pages. His eyes darted across the evidence, dates, names. Transactions, each line stripping away another layer of his denial. His breath hitched, his face paling as the depth of their case sank in. He'd underestimated them. Assumed his allies would shield him forever. Now, that illusion was ash. "What do you want to know?" Barnes muttered at last, his voice a ghost of itself, hollow with defeat. Maurice leaned forward. His pulse steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Start with the names," he said. "Who's been covering for you? Who's kept this machine running?" Barnes hesitated. His lips parting as if to argue, but the fight had drained out of him. He was a man staring into the abyss of his own making, and Maurice could see the moment he broke, the moment justice, long delayed, began to take root. "There are people in the precinct," Barnes began, his words halting, heavy with the weight of betrayal and the consequences he could no longer escape. The dimly lit interrogation room buzzed with tension, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and desperation. Barnes sat hunched over the scratched metal table. His eyes flickering nervously around the space, darting from the flickering fluorescent light overhead to the chipped paint on the walls, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. His once confident demeanor had eroded, leaving behind a man who looked smaller, frilier, than Maurice had ever imagined him. The higher-ups. Those shadowy figures who pulled strings from behind closed doors, had spent years ensuring their secrets stayed buried. But it wasn't just them, there were others. Outsiders with deep pockets and deeper connections, tangled in a web of influence that stretched far beyond the precinct's walls. Maurice stood across from him, arms crossed. His voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Give us the names, Barnes," he demanded, his tone unwavering, a mix of authority and disgust. Barnes hesitated. His breath hitching as he weighed his options. His fingers twitched against the tabletop, nails scraping faintly against the surface. The room seemed to close in around him. The weight of his choices pressing down like a physical force. Then, slowly, he began to speak. Each name slipped from his lips like a reluctant confession, heavy with the gravity of betrayal. It was as if he were handing over fragments of a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a part of the ugly truth Maurice and Harris had been chasing for months. Maurice watched him closely. Noting the way his shoulders slumped further with every word, the way his voice trembled as if he could feel the noose tightening around his neck. Around the room. The other officers exchanged glances, their faces etched with grim realization. This wasn't just a single bad apple, it was a rotting orchard, sprawling and insidious. Far bigger than any of them had dared to imagine. When Barnes finished, he lifted his hollow gaze to Maurice, his eyes sunken and shadowed, a man stripped bare by his own admissions. "Is that enough?" he asked, his voice cracking, a pitiful plea laced with fear. "Will that get me out of this?" The question hung in the air, fragile and desperate. As if he still believed he could barter his way out of the mess he'd made. Maurice didn't respond immediately. He'd gotten what he needed, the names. The keys to unlocking this festering corruption, but there was something profoundly unsettling about Barnes' attempt to negotiate. Even now, cornered and exposed. He clung to the delusion that he could wiggle free, that his years of abusing power might still buy him a lifeline. Maurice's jaw tightened, his dark eyes narrowing as he leaned forward slightly. "We'll see," he said at last, his voice cold and unyielding, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions churning inside him. But understand this, Barnes, this isn't just about you anymore. This is about making damn sure this never happens again. And if that means dragging every single one of those names you just gave us through the mud and into a cell, then that's exactly what we're going to do. Barnes slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him like water from a cracked vase. His head bowed, and for a fleeting moment, Maurice felt a sharp pang of something close to pity pierce through his resolve. Barnes had been a man with a badge once, a man who'd sworn to protect, not prey upon. But that flicker of sympathy was quickly extinguished by the memory of the lives he'd ruined, the trust he'd shattered. Barnes had chosen this path, step by deliberate step. And now the consequences were crashing down around him like a tidal wave he couldn't outrun. Maurice turned away, leaving the defeated figure behind as Harris stepped in. His phone already pressed to his ear. The younger officer's voice was steady as he barked orders, arranging for the names to be documented, for investigations to be launched. His efficiency was a quiet comfort to Maurice, a reminder that there were still good people in this fight. Stepping outside, Maurice was hit by a blast of cool night air, sharp and biting against his flushed skin. He tilted his head back, taking a deep, shuddering breath, trying to shake off the suffocating weight of the interrogation. The stars above twinkled faintly, barely piercing through the city's haze, but they offered a sliver of calm amidst the chaos replaying in his mind. He couldn't stop seeing Barnes' face, hearing the names that had tumbled out. Each one a brick in the wall of corruption they were now tasked with dismantling. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind him, and he turned to see Lisa leaning against their beat-up sedan, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of a street lamp. She'd insisted on being here tonight, despite his protests, her stubbornness a force as immovable as the earth itself. Her dark hair fluttered slightly in the breeze, and her eyes, sharp, searching, met his with a quiet intensity. "How did it go?" she asked. Her voice soft but laced with a concern that tugged at his chest. "We got him," Maurice replied, but there was no victory in his tone. Only a bone-deep weariness tempered by a flicker of satisfaction. He talked. "Gave us the names we needed. It's going to be a hell of a fight. But we've got the ammunition to bring this into the light." Lisa's expression softened, and she stepped closer, her hand finding his arm. The warmth of her touch grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of his spiraling thoughts. "I'm proud of you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried a strength that steadied him. "I know this wasn't easy." Maurice nodded, his throat tight. He didn't trust himself to speak, unsure of the tangled knot of emotions, relief, anger, exhaustion, that churned within him. He'd spent so long clawing toward this moment, and now that it was here, all he could think about was the mountain of work still ahead. They stood there in silence, the vast night stretching out around them, a canvas of shadows and distant city sounds. His phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the stillness. He pulled it out, half expecting another anonymous threat, another attempt to intimidate him into backing off. Instead, it was Harris, his message short and to the point, *, good work. It's not over. But we're closer than we've ever been, *. Maurice read it twice, then lifted his gaze to the sky again. The stars seemed a little brighter now, a faint promise against the darkness. He didn't know what tomorrow would hold, more battles, more resistance, but for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope. They were moving forward. And no matter how hard Barnes or his cronies fought to cling to their power, Maurice and his team weren't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were a whirlwind of upheaval. A storm of chaos and revelation that swept through the city like wildfire. Morris's plan, bolstered by Harris's relentless determination and the unwavering resolve of a handful of loyal officers, had worked beyond their wildest hopes. The names Barnes had spilled were the first dominoes to fall, triggering a full-scale investigation that rippled outward, far beyond the precinct's grimy walls. One by one, the implicated were hauled in, corrupt cops with blood on their hands, shady business owners with greased palms, even city officials who'd grown fat on bribes while turning a blind eye. Each interrogation was a scene of its own, a sweaty, stammering lieutenant denying everything until the evidence was shoved in his face, a slick-suited entrepreneur pacing his cell, muttering about lawyers who never came, a councilman weeping as his carefully curated life unraveled on live television. Barnes' confession had been the initial crack in the dam. And now the floodwaters were rushing through, tearing down a network that had thrived in the shadows for years. The media descended like vultures, cameras flashing and microphones thrusting forward as the story exploded across every channel. Headlines screamed of arrests, scandals, and the betrayal of public trust. Faces once synonymous with power, smug, untouchable, now stared out from screens with wide-eyed shock, their carefully crafted masks replaced by panic and disgrace. For Maurice, it was a vindication of everything he'd fought for, not just in these grueling weeks but across his entire career. Every late night, every threat, every moment of doubt had led to this. But the victory came at a cost. The backlash was ferocious, anonymous letters stuffed with venom, smear campaigns painting him and Harris as reckless vigilantes. Even whispers of corruption turned back on them. Maurice had expected it, braced himself for the onslaught, but what he hadn't anticipated was the swell of support rising from the ashes. Ordinary people, shopkeepers, teachers, parents who'd lived in fear of Barnes and his ilk, began to step forward. Their voices, once silenced, now rang out with stories of extortion, intimidation, abuse. Each tale was a brick added to the case, a testament to a community reclaiming its power. This wasn't just Morris's fight anymore, it belonged to them all. One humid afternoon, after a marathon hearing at the courthouse, Maurice emerged into the blinding sunlight, his tie loosened and his shirt clinging to his back. Lisa was waiting for him, as she always did. Her figure a steady anchor amidst the swarm of reporters and onlookers. She'd been his rock through this storm, her quiet courage a lifeline when his own resolve wavered. Today, though, there was something different in her, a spark of joy that lit up her face, a rare, radiant smile that made his chest ache with something like hope. "They did it," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained excitement. "The DA's office just announced they're pressing charges against every single name Barnes gave up. They're not backing down." Relief crashed over Maurice like a wave, and he pulled her into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair as the weight of her words sank in. "It's happening," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "We're finally getting justice." And they were. Barnes, stripped of his badge and his power, faced a litany of charges that would lock him away for decades. In a final, pathetic bid for leniency, he tried to cut another deal, his voice whining through the courtroom as he begged for mercy. But the evidence was a mountain too high to climb. And the judge's gavel fell with a resounding crack: no deals, no escape. For the first time, Barnes was powerless, a king dethroned, left to rot in the kingdom he'd built on the backs of others. Harris, meanwhile, stood taller than ever. His role in dismantling the network earned him a promotion, his name spoken with respect in precinct halls that had once echoed with cynicism. On the courthouse steps, he clasped Morris's hand, his grip firm. "You did good, Agent Hill," he said, his voice warm with admiration. "I don't think we could have pulled this off without you." Maurice returned the handshake, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "We did it together, Harris. This was everyone's fight." Lisa, too, emerged from the ordeal transformed. She'd faced Barnes' bullying with a defiance that left him rattled, and now she channeled that fire into something bigger. With the case drawing national attention, she seized the platform. advocating for reforms to root out corruption before it could take hold again. Her voice, once quiet, now carried across airwaves and auditoriums, a call to arms for accountability and change. For Maurice, the triumph was bittersweet. He'd set out to take down one corrupt cop, but what he'd uncovered was a system rotten to its core. They'd struck a mighty blow, but the war wasn't over. Yet as he stood beside Lisa, her strength radiating like a beacon, he knew they were ready for the next battle. Together, they'd faced the abyss and come out stronger. This wasn't just their story, it was a lesson etched in blood and sweat. Power, when abused, breeds its own downfall. Barnes had thought himself invincible. But he'd underestimated the force of people united, the courage of those who refused to bow. Justice wasn't a gift, it was a fight, and they'd proven it could be won. In a small, dusty town where the sun seemed to linger too long in the sky, Morris stood alone, his shadow stretching across the cracked pavement like a silent witness to his defiance. His heart pounded with a mixture of dread and determination, each beat echoing the weight of a decision he'd wrestled with for months. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and the faint hum of cicadas, a backdrop to the storm brewing inside him. He wasn't just facing a man, he was facing a system. A towering Goliath clad in the armor of authority, wielding a badge that gleamed with unearned power. The sheriff, a figure whose broad shoulders and steely gaze had long intimidated the townsfolk, had ruled this place like a petty king, his word law, his whims unchallenged. But Morris had seen too much, families shattered, voices silenced. Lives crushed under the weight of that badge, and the fire in his chest wouldn't let him stay quiet any longer. The sheriff's deputy, a wiry man named Hank with sunken eyes and a nervous twitch, lingered nearby, his boots scuffing the ground as he shifted uncomfortably. Hank wasn't cruel by nature, but years of following orders had dulled his conscience, turning him into a shadow of the man he'd once hoped to be. He watched Morris with a flicker of unease, his fingers brushing the holster at his side. Torn between loyalty to his boss and the gnawing suspicion that something was deeply wrong. The townspeople, too, hovered at the edges of the scene, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. There was Clara, the baker's widow, whose trembling hands clutched a worn apron as she remembered her son, lost to the sheriff's justice after a petty theft. And old man Jenkins, leaning on his cane, his rheumy eyes glinting with a spark of pride as he whispered to his grandson about the courage it took to stand tall. Morris's voice, when it finally broke the tense silence, was steady but laced with a raw edge, like a blade honed by years of suppressed rage. He called out the sheriff's crimes, extortion masked as fines, beatings passed off as discipline, lives ruined under the guise of order. Each word landed like a stone, rippling through the crowd, stirring murmurs and gasps. The sheriff's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the pavement with deliberate menace. He towered over Morris, his shadow swallowing the smaller man, and sneered, "You think you can challenge me, boy? This town's mine." His voice was a low growl, dripping with arrogance, but beneath it, there was a tremor, a crack in the armor he hadn't noticed until now. What followed was chaos unleashed in slow motion. Morris didn't flinch as the sheriff lunged, his meaty fist swinging with the force of a man used to getting his way. But Morris ducked, his lean frame moving with a grace born of desperation, and the crowd gasped as the sheriff stumbled, off balance and furious. Hank hesitated, his hand hovering over his gun, sweat beading on his brow as he wrestled with the choice to intervene. Clara clutched her apron tighter, her breath hitching as she silently prayed for Morris to prevail, her heart aching with the memory of her son's lifeless body. Jenkins gripped his cane, his frail body trembling with a surge of adrenaline, as if he could will his old bones to join the fight. The struggle stretched on, each moment heavy with the weight of what it meant, not just for Morris, but for everyone watching. Dust swirled around them, kicked up by scuffling feet. as the sheriff's grunts of exertion mixed with Morris's sharp, defiant shouts. Finally, with a surge of strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself, Morris drove the sheriff to his knees, pinning him to the ground. The badge clattered to the pavement, its shine dulled by the dirt, and a hush fell over the crowd. Hank stepped back, his hands falling limp at his sides, his face pale as the reality of his complicity crashed over him. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears, a sob breaking free as she felt a flicker of vindication for her boy. Jenkins nodded slowly, a faint smile tugging at his lips, as if he'd just witnessed the dawn of something new. Morris's victory was more than a single triumph, it was a beacon, a fragile flame flickering against the darkness of unchecked power. As he stood over the fallen sheriff, chest heaving, his eyes swept the crowd, taking in their faces, their stories, their silent suffering. He didn't need to speak, his presence said it all. One man, armed with nothing but courage, had toppled a tyrant. But as the adrenaline faded, a heavier truth settled into his bones. This wasn't the end. Out there, beyond the town's borders, how many more hid behind badges or titles? Cloaked in authority, believing they could bend the world to their will? How many others cowered in the shadows, their voices stolen by fear? Convinced no one would hear their cries or fight their battles? Hank slunk away, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a millstone. He'd never wielded the sheriff's cruelty, but he'd stood by, a silent cog in the machine, and that guilt gnawed at him now, sharp and relentless. Clara approached Morris later, her hand still trembling as she pressed a loaf of bread into his arms, a small, heartfelt offering from a woman who'd lost everything but refused to let her spirit break. Jenkins, too, lingered, his grandson at his side, recounting tales of older rebellions, his voice quavering with pride as he passed the torch of vigilance to the next generation. The lesson carved into that dusty street was stark and undeniable: justice isn't a gift bestowed from above, it's a fire that must be kindled, tended, and fought for, even when the odds loom large and the cost feels unbearable. The fall of the sheriff laid bare the rod of power abused, a warning etched in every bruise and tear that those who wield authority must answer for it. Morris's stand rippled outward, a call to the weary and the broken to rise, to speak, to hold fast against the tide. It demanded vigilance from all, a shared burden to root out the hidden tyrants and lift up the silenced, because the fight for what's right is a chain unbroken, linking every heart brave enough to care. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town, the air grew still, but the echoes of that day lingered. Morris walked home alone, his steps heavy with exhaustion, his mind swirling with questions he couldn't answer. The victory was his, but it was bittersweet, a single note in a song that stretched far beyond him. The townsfolk dispersed, their whispers carrying a new resolve, a fragile promise to stand together. Somewhere, out in the vast, unseen world, others waited, some to oppress, some to resist, and the wheel of justice turned on, relentless and incomplete, fueled by the courage of those who dared to face the giants.